Yorke Rhodes is the Director of Digital Transformation, Blockchain, Cloud Supply Chain at Microsoft, and he is the co-founder of Blockchain at Microsoft. Microsoft is a large Web 2 company producing software, consumer electronics, personal computers, and related services. We dive into what Microsoft is doing within the blockchain technology space, how Microsoft is using NFTs internally, the use case of Ethereum and IPFS inside of Microsoft, the differences in CEO leadership that Microsoft has seen over the years, and we even get into the rumors of Google choosing their slogan, "Don't be evil," because of Microsoft. That and so much more. But first, Yorke is going to tell us what his current focus is at Microsoft.
Obviously, for the last 2.5 years, approximately, I've been sitting in a strategy and transformation role in blockchain and Web3 specifically, and many other technologies, but with a primary focus on Web3. The role actually sits within one of the largest supply chains in the world, and this is work that I started actually in the context of my prior role, but have been sort of fully immersed in productionalizing a blockchain-based full stack application, of which blockchain and IPFS are a foundational part and a really important part. But you also have to, in the context of a business, build a full stack application on top of that in order to enable the business processes that the business can understand.
Very interesting. I would love to double click into that because I think one of the pieces about Web3 and crypto is that it's kind of open. And I think this is sometimes where Web2 and Web3 clash a little bit because Web3 wants to keep everything decentralized and fully open to kind of give power and control back to the users. But it's interesting that you're kind of building that on top. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And then what does that look like? Are there centralized pieces to that? How are you thinking about it?
Yeah, so we actually started with a thesis around blockchain and supply chain. Really, this journey started in 2018 with the first conversation. We had some ideas, and in fact, you can go back and read one of my blogs a long time ago, which the whole reason why I was interested in enterprise supply chains in the first place was because of the opportunity of where it actually intersects with the developing world in the raw materials context, right? And so that's sort of what intrigued me initially as a sort of a funded way to deal with a humanitarian problem. And then secondly, as we got into it, we started to realize the magnitude of the opportunity around, traceability of high value goods. But then on top of that, the transformative opportunity around finances of these high value goods. And as we've gone through this journey, we have also realized how this technical approach basically solves for a distributed system across an N-party supply chain, whereas most supply chain modules, things like SAP and Dynamics, they assume a direct supplier-buyer relationship. And in any complex supply chain, that's not the case. And so we're actually solving for a category of things that is not solved for by existing massive ERP systems like those products, among many others.
Amazing. And then who would be the clients of that?
Yeah, so this is a essentially high-tech industry, enterprise-focused supply chain solution. So the supplier partners are all of the commodities suppliers in the high-tech industry. And I'll caveat that with that it now includes automotive and includes many other industries as well, because all of these components now exist in the context of other computing systems in other industries, right? And so what's interesting about this is that we have Microsoft is essentially an anchor tenant doing this and investing in it for our purposes. We have Lenovo as a participant. We have AMD's, Intel, NVIDIA, ZT Systems, and many other suppliers who are providing all these high-value active goods in the high-tech industry, which go into essentially every computing platform, including cloud, PCs, laptops, and phones. So Samsung, as an example, obviously is a big manufacturer in the phone space as well as the hard drive space. is an obvious participant. Basically, any of the active components which exist in the high-tech ecosystem are participants in the supply chain. The benefit of doing this work in the context of Microsoft's cloud as one of the largest supply chains in the world consuming these components is that we actually have an incentive ourselves to drive to the end product or the end state, right, that we're trying to get to. It would be very hard to do this somewhere else and really drive forward.
Got it. Well, that's great. And then tell us, how did you start in the blockchain space initially? I know it's been a while, and how are you thinking about that in the context of Microsoft?
Yeah, so I actually fell into the blockchain space in the context of my constant researching for new innovative, technology waves that are happening, which, you might question why I didn't fall down the AI rabbit hole, right? Versus the Web3 rabbit hole. Certainly, the AI, is a very different technology. And 8.5 years ago, approximately, when I started this journey, didn't look like it looks today, right? In terms of the capabilities that we're seeing with Chat GPT and other things like that from OpenAI. I basically, I constantly read, I follow, social media, what's going on. And the start of my journey was exactly that. It was just a discovery of computer science terminology that I hadn't seen in a while. And I started reading, and I kept reading. And this was in early 2015. So I spent a lot of time reading. And as I read more and more, I realized that the context of public blockchains solved for problems that were actually quite hard to solve for in my technology career in the past. And things that it solved for were things like unique identification of things, right, and people outside the context or transcending the boundaries of the context of an enterprise. And that immediately, obviously, led me down this sort of humanitarian road, thinking about humanitarian identity and other opportunities there. And the intersection of the humanitarian opportunity with this novel distributed system approach that was solving for things that I found very difficult to do in my career, sort of resonated well with me, and I just started down this journey. So I spent about 6 months sort of convincing myself that what I thought was true actually was true, from there it was sort of like, well, what do I do about it, right?
Amazing. And then why are you excited about crypto and Web3, and how do you kind of view the space in general and overall?
Yeah, I think, clearly from 2015 until today, it has been a very significant journey with lots of valleys and peaks of activity, whether in the context of technical adoption, changes in how we view the technology, evolution of technology, right, as you go from really something that was completely nascent at the time in the Ethereum public network to today, where we've gone through the merge, which is just a massive change. And as I think I've tweeted about, something from a climate perspective, we probably will not see another organization in the world achieve that type of change effectively overnight, right, in terms of the carbon footprint. So it's a pretty massive historical moment. So that's exciting to me. I think actually that opens up many more opportunities because most large enterprises are very sensitive to their carbon footprint. And so the question, becomes, okay, what is our mitigation of an approach when we're building systems? How do we make sure that those systems are not abusive and frankly against our principles and our guidelines? I think we are, 8.5, we're going to be 10 years in pretty soon, right? In terms of at least the public blockchain as a computing mechanism and a distributed system that supports that. I think there's huge opportunities going forward to continue to build in that space. It's just a very different pattern than we've built in enterprise, in companies before. Basically, all systems have essentially been siloed. And so it's a great evolution of open source and distributed systems.
Absolutely. And then Microsoft has a lot of moving parts. So between cloud and social and developer resources and then even gaming, how does Web3 and crypto kind of fit into that? Can you kind of double click into that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's an important one to sort of unpack a little bit. I mean, Microsoft is a it's a large number of massive divisions of individual capabilities, whether it's our browser and Bing business, which is our search business, or our LinkedIn business, which stands on its own, right, essentially, and has a P&L associated with it in the context of what you call social, which I would say that's what it is, but it's certainly not, right? Instagram and TikTok and YouTube and Twitter, all the way through to our Dynamics business, which is basically a full-on ERP type of business, competing in the market alongside companies like SAP. To our gaming business, which is actually a very large business. It's actually quite complex as well because it's a combination of studios that Microsoft owns that build products over a course of years, right, and bring out all of the things like Minecraft and other products that are just games in the category, to a console business, which has always been a hardware loss leader historically. To a cloud gaming business, which we're very much been driving forward, which basically allows games to be played on any device, leveraging the cloud scale, GPU capabilities in the background, and not to mention Office and our Azure cloud business. Right, it's a very large company with many different types of products, which is one of the things that makes it interesting to me. And so to now answer your question, which is like, how do you strategize on anything in a company of that size? And I think the answer is largely that you can be a catalyst and an instigator, but ultimately the business has to decide when they're going to prioritize certain capabilities in their business that actually work for them, right? And so one of the things that I always say is that like product teams will have their own cycles and they'll do what they want to do from a prioritization perspective. What we have to do as innovators is basically educate, make sure that there's clear understanding on what the capabilities are and the advantages are of an approach in a particular category. And then take the opportunities where they exist, right? And drive forward where those opportunities are. And so a great example of that is the decentralized identity work that exists in the context of our identity engineering organization, where since 2016, they've been incubating the concept of DIDs and how that would facilitate itself into product inside of Microsoft. And it now exists actually in general availability under the umbrella of the Entra identity suite of products that Microsoft offers. That there were some initial choices of how that was built, not the choices that I would have made, but they were basically designed as decentralized identity, trying to achieve the value proposition of uncorruptible identity systems, right, by a single party, and that party could be an enterprise that gets taken over by a changed regime, for example, or which obviously would be very bad, right? From a humanitarian perspective. So it's a very interesting lens. I think what you'll also see, as you've seen in some other companies, is the concept of just digital certificates or digital assets and digital ownership rewards, whether people will call them specifically blockchain tokens or Web3 tokens. or not, I think actually is beside the point. I mean, it's useful for the industry for people to know what they are. But I think in the context of any individual business, what those businesses do with it, how it shows up is I think where we're going to see a lot of fluidity in terms of terminology across product teams within Microsoft and elsewhere.
I'm sure it's kind of challenging because you probably get questions from everyone all across the curve, one day in gaming, one day in social, one day in crypto, but I'm sure it's also equally exciting. And then how would you say, because I know a lot of companies, a lot of individuals within larger companies are experiencing similar, where they want to kind of push something up the curve. Maybe it's having tokens on the balance sheet as an example, which has been challenging for a lot of companies and also venture capitalist firms to kind of keep up with the innovation. How would you say, I'm sure you've kind of built a craft when it comes to educating the company and getting things pushed through. Any advice you would have for anyone who's maybe trying to do something similar in their company?
Yeah. So a long time ago, that when I started this journey, and I asked this question earlier in our discussion, like, what next, right? What do I do? How do I do this, right? And so what I did was interestingly, I had been teaching, entrepreneurship for enterprises in the context of my teaching role at NYU, and developed some courseware on this. But what I essentially did was I turned my startup instincts internally and decided that, okay, how would I do this if I was a startup and the ecosystem was outside of a company, right? And so I basically translated that into, well, let's assume that, the ecosystem that I have to do this in is in the context of a large corporation. So how do I go about doing that? And all of those same instincts and qualities that you need in a startup actually are required in the context of doing this in any ecosystem, and even inside of a company. So the common mantras that I use are 95% of the time, the answer will be no, right? And so what does that mean from a startup founder perspective? That's just resilience, right? That's what you expect, right? And so you just keep going, right? And resilience is a core quality, I think, for success in anything, but particularly on an innovation journey where 95% of the time you're hearing negative answers, right, on things. And so I would say that's the number one thing. Number two is it's not emotional. Like, understand the business and understand that there are business reasons for making decisions, and this is how I sort of talk about it from a product lens perspective. And those decisions really are, prioritizations based on what the business needs to achieve, and then from there become, the technical approaches to those things, right? So if you go back to, where you never want to be in a startup that has to make revenue is educating the market. Well, we're certainly still in the area where, you have to educate all the time. And so, internal discussion forums. I actually run a weekly crypto briefing series. I'd love to have you on, talk about the graph at some point, where we basically do weekly 1-hour sessions where we invite in, founders to talk about the work that they're doing and record it and provide it as a library internally. That's just one example. There are lots of discussion forums that I often feel very repetitive when I'm posting in them, because I want to make sure that the information is in multiple different channels. And yeah, it's just, it's a journey.
Absolutely. Yeah. Resilience and perseverance, but good for you for kind of putting up that fight internally. And then I know you started 2015, 2016. Was it difficult kind of keeping up the excitement inside of Microsoft, both for yourself and for the company?
Yeah. It's interesting. Companies all have sort of default behaviors. Microsoft is no different. And innovators have very different default behaviors, right? So the challenge is that those things diverge, right? Like, people who are not innovators always choose the easy path, right? Like, what's the easiest thing to do? I don't really care about XYZ, right? So I'm just going to do whatever the default is. And I think this is actually, one of the largest challenges with innovation in an enterprise is that the way enterprises are structured, they're structured to pick the easy path. What that means for an individual employee perspective is an employee's goals are not aligned to long-term innovation. Right, they're aligned to the quarterly metrics that they have to achieve if they're in a sales capacity or product capacity, and they're certainly aligned to the yearly rewards cycles, right? That you have to achieve. And so, what happens in a lot of large corporations is like people just get beaten down to the point that all they think about is, it's going to be the holiday season, so it's going to be really quiet for a month and a half, right? And then we're going to start up the second half of the calendar year, and our reviews happen. Our fiscal end is July 1, so all of our end of year reviews happen in the May to June timeframe, right? So people just fall into this cadence at a company, any large enterprise, but I'm giving you a Microsoft example, where they focus more on having job safety and job success than like having a mission for why they do what they do, right? And clearly in a context of a startup, you have a mission, right? And that's the first thing, or else like you can never get up every day and do what you do, right? So you have to take a little bit of that with you inside of large enterprise. And to your point about excitement, I think that there's probably a timeline. AI is a good example, right? Like AI has been around for 10 plus years, right? All of a sudden, and there have been cycles of excitement in AI as well, similarly, right? And right now we actually happen to be in a very interesting cycle because of what's been enabled in the last 6 to 12 months in terms of AI. That same thing is happening in the Web3 space, right? Or the blockchain space, or the enterprise blockchain space, or the crypto space, whatever you want to call, the particular focus. And I think the core thing to recognize is that in a large enterprise, everything's a journey, and things just take time. And if you don't have resilience, then right, you're gonna wind up getting exhausted just trying to keep yourself excited, to keep other people excited. So it's very similar in that regard to what you see in a startup.
Totally. I really appreciate that positioning too, because just running a tech company, you bring people in from larger companies, and sometimes they want to take more of that pragmatic approach where you're like, no, we can't do that because we have this mission, and if we take that route, we're stuck there and we can't get to the mission. So it's interesting that you frame it that way around the innovator. And I think also too, AI is a great example, but Ethereum, I think, took about 5 years before we saw product market fit and applications building on Ethereum. And a lot of that was due to like the tooling that came around Ethereum. So yeah, it's a great point that innovation does take time.
The Glow Dollar is a new stablecoin with a very special property. As its market cap goes up, extreme poverty goes down. Glow donates 100% of its profits to people in countries like Kenya and Liberia as basic income. If Glow grows as big as Dogecoin, it will lift 1 million people out of poverty. With Glow, you can reduce poverty just by holding a stablecoin. It's launching early 2023. Join the waitlist at glowdollar.org/defiant. That's glowdollar.org/defiant.
What's the attitude like now? Obviously, things have happened in the industry in 2022. What would you say is the attitude inside of Microsoft now around crypto and blockchain, just given the bear market and also the FTX blow up?
I mean, you can see like people are people, right? And this is so the type of behavior you see on Twitter as a result of the massive fraud that FTX was, that use the crypto industry as its tool, it is used as an excuse, right, for people to say, we don't want to do that, right? Like this actually is the thing I thought it was, right? Which is the biggest unfortunate thing about people using the crypto industry as a tool for their own personal gain, at the detriment of consumers. So that. Absolutely. I sort of said it before, right? That type of behavior bleeds directly into the minds of employees to say, why should we try that, right? So you have to overcome that, right? And this is where negative market cycles and or massive frauds that are obvious frauds can harm an innovation cycle. And those those happen across different industries, obviously, but FTX is certainly the biggest, loudest example, and partly because of the hubris of the founder, right, to just be so blatant about in some ways what he was doing, but actually being very public, telling people he was doing the exact opposite, and it's hard, right? So you have to I don't have a clear answer for you, but the distinction that we have to make is that this was a choice in a centralized organization to basically perform fraud, right, and embezzlement, and crypto was the tool, right, because of the lack of required oversight and regulations, right. So it's not. It will certainly change the industry. It's going to cause, we're already starting to see this, cause a lot of desire for more types of regulation. But the impact on that is it's not positive, certainly, right? In any particular market. But I think for people who understand that and believe that technical innovation is important, they continue working, right? Where you have people who've sort of crossed the chasm, generally you're going to have a decently sized number of believers who then understand that this is different, and that things like FTX were an aberration, not by design, right? In terms of the industry.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's very well said. It's unfortunate, but I do think it was getting a little bit out of hand with the bull market and the super cycle meme and the WAGMI meme. And I think that a lot of founders were being pulled in 900 directions, and now it feels a little bit more quiet. You can continue building, focus on your mission, and I think we'll come out stronger on the other side. And as you mentioned, it's a failure of centralized finance. It's not a failure of decentralized finance. And if anything, it points to the success of decentralized finance, something like a Uniswap where they don't take client funds, and the power of that. So hopefully we all come out stronger on the other end. And I know you started kind of famously within the Ethereum Enterprise Alliance. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we recognized pretty early, basically in 2016, along with some collaborators in the space who helped to co-found the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. We recognized that this could go down a road very similar to the Unix road, where you just had complete incompatibility, right, in application stacks being used in an enterprise context. And so the real goal initially was to drive towards very compatible and aligned with Ethereum stacks that we're not just reinventing the wheel over and over again, right? And so the first thing we did was we basically looked at what was the most mature enterprise blockchain stack at the time, Quorum, and chose that as essentially a default template for what it would look like to have an enterprise class stack, and then continue to iterate around that in terms of guiding others along the appropriate path and journey around requirements. And today, the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance is alive and well, and has been embracing over the past year plus more and more crypto native companies like Coinbase and others, Polygon, example, to just participate in the work that we're doing. We've always had the Ethereum Foundation as a board member on the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, and so tight connection into folks at the Ethereum Foundation, and so it's continuing. I think what we'll see going forward as this recognition of the capabilities of privacy enablement through zero knowledge proofs and layer 2s in the public blockchain space, we'll see more and more of that in the enterprise space, and therefore the necessity of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance to really take a point of view on that, and sort of take this moment in time, very similar to what we did when we founded it in 2016, to say, okay, we need to now be focusing on what's very relevant today, as things go forward.
Absolutely. And I know there's been an evolution when it comes to the thinking of how blockchains kind of fit into a more enterprise type system. And I would say it's definitely evolved. I remember they used to say, a lot of people used to think like, oh, we'll just create a private blockchain internally. And I always thought that was confusing because we've always had federated databases. They don't work very well. And I was always impressed that Microsoft didn't go that route and went more towards the tooling side of things. So can you talk a little bit about that evolution from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people, technology is a tool that can be used and misused. And I think in the context of a lot of the misunderstanding of what a transactional system with sidecar storage actually is designed for in a distributed system outside of an enterprise, how that would translate into products and tools. I think the enterprise blockchain space, you could say in some ways, depending on your perspective, that you gave an example of like, do I use this thing inside my company? Well, does that make sense, right? When you can actually use more efficient tools, right? When you have 100% control over the environment and the outcomes and things like that, right? And I think that was a derailment that a lot of people in the enterprise blockchain space took, just because they didn't recognize this context around you cannot have censorship resistance and uncorruptibility when there's single party control, right? And so that core concept was lost on some folks, I think. And then you can have like the quote unquote consortium space, right, which was like, okay, well, we recognize that we need to do something outside of the context of an enterprise. How do we do that in the context of governance outside of the enterprise? And that led to this very nebulous and sometimes problematic terminology around consortiums and what is that, right, and what makes sense there. And by the way, just going back to the point I made about the supply chain work earlier, the core recognition about control outside of the center and also an end-tier problem is also part of that recognition around, well, this is not something you could easily do with an existing technology, right? And so don't try to make blockchain look like a database, which is kind of the Hyperledger Fabric example, right? And the problem, with giving people that perception is you have a lot of systems integrators who will respond to customer requests and demand, no matter what those requests and demands are and whether they make any sense, because what makes sense to a systems integrator is services revenue, right? And so if a customer wants to go build something, right, your services revenue trumps essentially your advice to not do that, right? And so we certainly saw that happen in the industry. The other thing is, if you were introduced to blockchain technology in the context of something like Hyperledger Fabric or Corda, which are purely enterprise, non-public distributed systems approaches, you had a very warped introduction, right? Because you didn't actually get that piece of education that's really important about what does it mean to be a public, good, distributed system and to be self-maintainable, right? And so there was definitely large organizations like IBM, right, went whole hog down the Hyperledger Fabric road, and a lot of their customers followed them, right, at least for a period of time. And if you asked folks like Brian Bellendorf, who at the time was running the Hyperledger Foundation, his belief was always that yes, we do need some kind of public, good ability to maintain the system through rewards or what have you. But there was no defined path for Hyperledger Fabric specifically to get there. But what you saw was the umbrella of Hyperledger became bigger to include products like Besu and lots of other products, Indy and others, right, that now had actually a public context. And so there was definitely recognition that there was more than just this thing that looks like a high-speed database. And by the way, I caution my teams on that regularly. They're like, well, why do we need IPFS? I'm like, because you don't store lots of data on a transactional blockchain system. It's just not designed for that. Oh, well, why not? Let's just give people opportunity. I said, as soon as you give people opportunity or options, then you've actually opened up Pandora's box, right? And they're going to go abuse it, and they're going to get into trouble and have to unwind that. Well, we know the lessons, so why should we allow people to actually go make those mistakes?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's great that you're helping them kind of navigate those waters. And then how did you choose IPFS over something like an Arweave as an example?
So, I mean, I've been in the space since 2015. I probably met Juan Benet around then. So I always knew about IPFS. And it was always, to me, a very fascinating technology. Products like Arweave came much later, right, in terms of their implementation. And we are using it in a very brute force way. We don't have any special, and by the way, we have, over the course of the couple of years that we've been doing this, we constantly reevaluate technical choices. And one of the questions we actually looked at was like, are there other things that would actually do some of the stuff that we need to do on top of IPFS, whether it's, I think it was called Textile, or other products like that. And the answer always came down to, well, we're using this kind of in a very simplistic way, designed specifically what IPFS is designed for. And these other systems actually layer on a lot of other stuff that's not useful because we have our own application stack, and we really wanted to fit well into that. And so for us, it just became about, sort of, it's a core protocol. It does the things that we needed to do. We have a full stack application that actually is doing the intelligence around that. And so, that made it pretty easy for us to, make those decisions. We're also not using it in a public context. Like, all of the stuff that we're doing is, within the context of peer networking and VPNs. And so we use IPFS with the privacy switch turned on, private, not privacy, private switch turned on, which means it's not part of the public network. And so we also have to facilitate resilience as we think about IPFS in a private context, because, as you know, like, if you don't pin stuff, right, it's going to age out over time, right? And so we also have to have those kinds of controls in our systems to ensure that, that works. And it's a pretty decent sidecar next to a quorum private implementation using Tessera, because basically what we've done in the context of this application stack is we need this private distributed storage, which is very tightly connected to the transactions on Ethereum, on Quorum, and we need the private network associated with IPFS to map directly to the Tessera privacy group. And so we've facilitated that through the work that we've done to ensure that we have the privacy group transactions only among those parties, and then distributed storage only among those parties.
Got it. It's always interesting to see how these protocols are being used in practice. So that's super exciting. And then you mentioned a little bit around your work inside the cloud. What is your strategy around the cloud and blockchains?
It's a really interesting question. I think, it's, the context of our work, specifically the work that I was just describing, is as a client application inside of an enterprise that happens to be sitting in the cloud organization, from a supply chain perspective. And we have fully embraced this idea that we need a distributed system like this to facilitate the work across an N-tier supplier base. We also have very significant regulations now around country of origin for products in the high-tech industry, as well as raw materials, essentially anti-slave labor regulation. And so both of those things are kind of hard to build if you're just thinking about the silo of your enterprise, right? And so that goes back to the point of an N-tier distributed system being a valuable tool in addition to all the other tools that we have. And so, in the context of the distributed system supply chain work in cloud and cloud supply chain, very much has a place at the table in terms of the strategy and why that strategy is there. In the context of what I think you might be asking, a little bit different question, which is, well, how do you reconcile cloud, which is completely centralized, right? And at least workloads, compute and storage managed by a single entity, or at least a sovereign entity in a public cloud scenario, or like a German cloud or other cloud, which is a separate sovereign entity, versus a distributed systems approach. We have to be very careful, right, in terms of maintaining the capabilities of a system that runs well in cloud. And that's where we really focus, like making sure that this thing runs very well in cloud, but also maintains the qualities of a true distributed system that exists outside of a single enterprise. Now, we can facilitate that through many customers running in our cloud, but in an ideal world, we have to provide the utility so that if someone doesn't want to be in our cloud, or they want to be, God forbid, on premises, and deal with that nightmare, that will work, right? And so, from a pragmatic perspective, as a development, you typically choose one target environment, but then make sure you have flexibility to go to others. And I'll give you like one of the examples of the challenges, for example, that R3 had with a lot of the enterprises that they were working with, forgetting that it's, a very different design point for Corda. They were dealing with a lot of on-prem customers, and the pain that they went through with those customers just to get product integrated into those on-prem systems was a long, long journey. And frankly, that's one of the reasons why cloud actually is quite valuable, right? Because it's very easy to spin up cloud resources, connect them, and peer them with other cloud resources. So I think there's a very natural, symbiotic relationship between decentralized systems and centralized provisioning through cloud. We see that, basically, Alchemy, Coinbase Cloud, Infura, and all of the others in the infrastructure space, right? Like, what choices did they make? They made choices to run in cloud. Why? Right? Because it's easy to provision and manage those services at scale, right? And so, do we want the decentralized industry to be beholden to a single provider? Absolutely not, right? And we're actually very interested in, and have had conversations with the Ethereum Foundation and others in the space, both in the context of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance and beyond, to have ways to incentivize decentralization of all of the things, right, that you would want to decentralize, right, in the context of Ethereum, multiple clients, multiple infrastructure providers, right, et cetera, et cetera. We would love to participate in programs that actually help to drive that.
I think that's great. And yeah, to your point, there's a lot of centralized RPC providers, and I think that they're a nice bridge to Web3, and they've kind of helped Web3 evolve. But you have to be intellectually honest that they're not Web3 as much as some of them claim to be because of that centralized factor. So it's a nice point out. Okay, I'm going to ask a question. So, a lot of people, they start out in Web 2 and they eventually shift to Web 3. You, on the other hand, have spent almost the last decade fighting the good fight inside of a Web 2 company. What's their secret to kind of keeping you there?
Great question. It's actually 8 years and 7 months, so not quite a decade. But yeah, it's.
So in crypto terms, it might be a little more than a decade.
It's definitely 2 decades in crypto terms. Well, a couple of things. One, and this is one of the things that, so I returned to Microsoft in November 2014, and it was mere months after that I actually fell down this rabbit hole. And that was the question that I said to you before. Well, now that I'm in this rabbit hole, what do I do? Right? And how do I set up myself for success? And that question is predicated upon the hard decision that I made actually to return to Microsoft. And when I say hard decision, I was at Microsoft when I was much, much younger, from 1992 until early 2000. So I spent 8 years at Microsoft in the 90s. And this was in the context of very different technologies, very different systems. It was really the evolution of networking, the evolution of client-server databases, right? There was a whole bunch of things that really didn't exist at the scale that they exist today. So I was very deliberate when I returned to Microsoft in 2014, and having been here for like less than 6 months, I was like, well, I made a very deliberate choice. So like, I need to reframe like why I'm doing what I'm doing. And so that's when I put on, my startup hat, and I said, well, I believe in this, and I believe in the capabilities and the possibilities for the humanitarian mission associated with this. And therefore, I'm going to go on this journey. I had no idea how long the journey was going to take, but what I did know was that, and what I said to my boss in early 2016 was, I'm going to work in this technical space for at least 10 years. And so if I'm going to stay working in the context of the job that I'm in now, then we have to pivot what I'm going to do. And, that was pretty much like my strategy, right? It was like, I'm going to do things that are relevant to this technology. And I've also had 3 very different roles at Microsoft. So while it's 8.5 years, I've had 2.5 to 3.5 years of each different role that I was in when I was at Microsoft, and that gives you a lot of fresh perspective. I started this journey in the context of a partner development where we were actually recruiting startups into the cloud, and that was really my primary goal. I was working with all these different startups in the Web3 space, and driving our knowledge and credibility in the community, and then educating people internally that, hey, this is an interesting space, right? And obviously the education continues. My second role was in the context of an engineering group that we specifically started to hold the portfolio of a number of assets in our Web3 work, which was, you mentioned earlier, developer tooling like Visual Studio and extensions for Solidity, et cetera. And we're still doing some of that work actually in other contexts. And then also, providing utility for enterprise customers who were going on this journey, because we understood what it takes to go on this learning journey, and the tooling through a blockchain service that allowed people to actually get an understanding of what the technology is without having to do it in a public context. So that was my second role. Part of that role was, working with advanced customers like the World Bank, and I worked on the bond project with the World Bank, and just as an example. And then this other major project that I was working on, it was sucking up more and more of my time, was the supply chain work. And so I was recruited to come over to the supply chain role 2.5 years ago. And so, that's sort of kept the journey fresh for me internally. The question and, sort of the driving factor was, well, I was very deliberate in why I wanted to return to Microsoft at the beginning of that. And then, I sort of just navigated that as I've gone through it. To more directly answer your question, are there really interesting and exciting companies and technologies in the Web3 space? Absolutely. And a lot of my colleagues have actually gone right to companies like that. For example, one of my colleagues on the blockchain engineering team went to Consensus for about 1.5 years, and he's now at Shrapnel, which is a gaming company in the blockchain space, and doing extremely well at Shrapnel. In terms of sort of driving forward this concept of digital assets, ownable digital assets in the context of gaming, and that the answer to that question is more about where I thrive as an individual in the context of the type of organization that I work in. I do much better when I have many products to think about than when I have just one product to think about. And so to me, like the context of my juggling 10 balls in the air versus what a startup does juggling 10 balls in the air is there's like these massive individual product teams, right? And that's the 10 balls, right? To sort of nudge forward. And to me, that's a useful way because I actually enjoy that more than I enjoy single focused one product I've always been a sort of a multi-product type of personality. And so, that's one of the primary drivers for me is like, I need to be at a company that, one, I respect from a culture perspective, but two, has enough product and landscape from that company that's interesting. There was probably something else I wanted to add to that, but I'll let you ask a question.
No, that's great. Hopefully they appreciate the loyalty, and you must be a very balanced person, kind of being able to handle all of the different balls in the air. I'm more of an all or nothing kind of person. So, but that's great that you know that about yourself. And okay, this question might be a little spicy, but I thought of it when you said that you returned to Microsoft. So there are rumors that Google branded "Don't Be Evil" because of Microsoft's quote unquote evil activities. I think that might be a little bit of a stretch, but I do know there was kind of a monopoly behavior, nothing that we're not used to in Web 2. But what are your thoughts on that, if any?
Well, I think we kind of come full circle, right? There was definitely a point in time when Google had a right to, say, like, don't be evil to others. But, I think we definitely come full circle on that, right? I don't know how else really to answer that. I think that, the market is what the market is. And, like you can look at any point in time, look at behaviors in any kind of competitive market and ascribe monopoly characteristics to particular markets. And the more you squint and the more you want it to look like that, the more it will, right? And actually, to some extent, Microsoft has always been an ecosystem enablement company. We never believed that we would ever create all the products that people want. We typically believe that we would create the products that are the most utilitarian across a very horizontal landscape that would then enable other businesses to grow on top of those. And I think you're probably referring to, sort of the browser wars and some of the packaging decisions that were made that resulted in particular competitors who weren't doing well in the market actually pointing fingers and, calling mom and dad on the phone and saying, hey, you need to look at this behavior, right?
I think it kind of always comes down to incentives. And if the incentive's there, someone's going to do it. I mean, you can point fingers at SBF, but frankly, like the incentive was there and it was likely that someone was going to take advantage of it. And I think that's why in Web3 and crypto, it's so important that we think about the incentives before we design the systems. And I think that that's one thing that I'm really excited about in the space.
I think your point about incentives is so critical to the space. We cannot design public goods without understanding how do we keep those public goods running, with various incentives. And to your point, like if you don't actually sort of game out the incentive models, you're going to wind up in places you did not anticipate.
Absolutely. And I think, to be fair, early days of Web 2, no one could really imagine the different types of business models that would spin up. And so now that we've kind of learned from that, we can make positive change. And I know you came into crypto, you came into this ecosystem more on the Ethereum side. Are you still mostly excited about Ethereum? And if any other ecosystems, what are you excited about?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, so, having started in 2015 when like Ethereum was really the only game in town, right, from this sort of mission perspective, it was an easy place to start, right? Like there was no other obvious place to start. And over time, I think what happens, and you mentioned this before, is like tooling becomes really important, right, as things scale. And so the gut reaction that I think there's two sort of gut reactions that people have. One is, well, what about this other thing? Because the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, right? That's one gut reaction. And then the other gut reaction is, well, you mean you're going to recreate all of that stuff that already exists, right? Like, and those are two things that I wrestle with all the time, right? Like, right when I think about other ecosystems, and whether it's other programming languages or other VMs or other consensus algorithms, right? Like those exact questions are the types of things that I ask myself all the time. The tooling is extremely important, though, right? Like the maturity of understanding in a particular framework in the market plus tooling is a mature market, right? Whereas a net new full application stack and framework and net new tooling and net new vulnerabilities introduced by every single change in a system or new system takes you back many years, right? And so to me, it's been easiest to justify, well, I'm working in the largest ecosystem. It's no longer just Ethereum with EVM compatibility. It's tens of systems with EVM compatibility. And adding on to that, then the very diverse community of layer 2 approaches, inclusive of privacy technology and scaling technology through zero knowledge proofs, is an amazing landscape to design in. And so to me, it's like, if that's all true, then why would I go start from fresh in another ecosystem, right? And so, that's my perspective, right? And I think if you're coming into the market new, you can easily go down another road, right? And just, you live with the choices that you make. And, I do think that there's a much richer landscape today in terms of the concept of, and I just mentioned tens or more of EVM compatible systems. That implies not one blockchain substrate, right? That implies multiple blockchain substrates. So that then drives you to, well, what's the problem if you have multiple blockchain substrates? You now have essentially a multi-chain world, right? And even if it's all EVM compatible, right, it's still a multi-chain world. So then there's a whole new design space for how do we most effectively deal with a multi-chain world. Is it bridges? I'm not so sure, right? Right, based on what we've seen in the market, it's a pretty tough thing, right? Or is it something like Hyperlane, where my son is working, which is very focused on start out thinking multi-chain when you design your solution, and you leverage that capability, right, to go and do that, avoiding the challenges of bridges with escrows and lockups and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I think I gave you a lot of answers, but
yeah, red pilling the children. I see. That's exciting.
That wasn't hard, by the way. It was an introduction to my son when he was in high school, because he was already a phenomenal programmer, and I was like, smartest people I know are working in this space. Why wouldn't I introduce him to it? And I had a very trusted friend and partner in Joe Lubin at Consensus in Brooklyn, not far from where I live. And I was like, hey, you know what? Joe, are you doing an intern class? Yeah, we are. We have a bunch of people. We'd love to have him, right? And so I introduced him. He literally took to it in weeks. I had to say nothing else, right? That. And so it was a good fit, and he really enjoyed it. And he went from basically 2 Consensus internships. He did an IBM internship, which was on the in the IBM garage, actually, in New York, which was one of those value cases where you say, well, I definitely don't want to do that in my life, right? Which is one of the things that's important about internships. And then he wound up working for Cello in his junior summer, and they basically hired him on following his junior summer. So he would spend a couple years there before what he's doing now. He actually worked for Tarun Chitra for a short while, and then he moved to Hyperlane.
Exciting. Very exciting. And to your point, I think a lot of the layer ones kind of underestimated the tooling aspect, and Ethereum kind of has a huge head start there. But to your point as well, we are going to live in this multi-chain future, and we need to make it composable. So that journey is upon us, I suppose. Are you looking for a stress-free crypto life in 2023? Forget about the hassles and go self-custodial with Oneinch. The Oneinch Wallet is the single app you need to manage crypto. Your Oneinch Wallet acts as a safe box due to hardware wallet connection, becomes your ultimate coin storage when adding custom tokens, offers full versatility thanks to multi-chain support, easy to use, secure, and self-custodial. One thing I've noticed in the crypto space, there's been a resurgence in NFTs. A lot of NFT projects are kind of coming back, even though the market is a little bit more grim. How is Microsoft thinking about NFTs, if at all?
So I've actually been running an internal project for more than a year now, unfortunately, which is an NFTs for Good project. And that's been a very useful education tool, in all aspects of thinking about NFTs. What I actually think is misunderstood is the design space that NFTs give you, because we ascribe certain qualities to NFTs that we see that are very visual. And it's actually one of the things I was thinking about. I just got notice that I was accepted as a speaker in NFT New York City, which is I've been speaking there since they started. But as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about this problem. Like, we ascribe certain qualities that are amazing, right, from an art perspective, right, to NFTs. But NFTs actually are just a token type that's extensible that you can do all kinds of things with, right? And so maybe helping expose people more to some of the design space and possibilities with NFTs is really important. Just generally, I think, in the market. By the way, we actually use NFTs as a tool in our supply chain work to be able to uniquely track all of these high value goods across our supply chain.
Amazing. And did you build that from scratch internally, or are you leveraging another project or protocol?
No, I mean, we just basically took ERC 2021 token formats and said, well, this is a great tool for, assigning qualities to a particular high value good, and being able to have sidecar very easily into IPFS for storage of lots of other stuff about it. Pretty easy choice that is the right token type to use and then extend. And we haven't extended it a whole lot, but part of that decision making was, well, do we just create something proprietary, or if we use something that exists, it basically gives us flexibility in terms of tooling and things like that. And as our solution and platform evolves, that's actually a good choice.
And then I assume, based on that answer, that we've seen Reddit, Instagram, Twitter, like you name it, Starbucks getting involved in NFTs. I assume that you think it will stick, but would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think I said this a little bit earlier in our conversation as well. It's like, not everybody's going to call them NFTs, right? Like Starbucks rewards points, great example for NFTs. I think, yes, there's no reason why we should not have a standard object type that has a lot of extensibility and flexibility. And actually can show up in all different wallets made by different manufacturers, as a displayable object and a transactable object. I think that's going back to the point I made earlier. Like, the fact that substrate exists is a pretty obvious place to go do new work and new design patterns. I think that's what brands like Nike and Starbucks and Adidas and Gucci and others recognize, is that, like, these are just digital consumer product goods, right? And I think we'll see an evolution in many different directions using the core ERC 721 or other 1155 or what have you formats that show up broadly in wallets and marketplaces, but they'll be used for all different types of things, and in a lot of cases won't even be called NFTs.
Absolutely. And then is there a universe where you see Microsoft maybe using tokens, call them whatever you want, for subscription models?
I would say I think there's absolutely a possibility that, because it makes sense, right? For example, a piece of software or a software license essentially is just an ownable thing, right? That's a perfect example of where you would, you could ascribe the qualities of NFT to that, right? entitlement to some extent, which is really what a license is, but it's also historically a physical thing as well, right? But a license is an entitlement, right? It's an entitlement to do something with a set of characteristics that can very easily be defined in an NFT, right? A rewards token, right? Same thing, right? It has a very specific set of characteristics where it's valuable, what you can do with it, who the parties are that you can do those things with. All of those things are very interesting landscape, and I think that's why you see, right, the consumer brands in particular looking at these technologies, because they're just a better way of doing what we've been trying to do, in the context of enterprise systems historically.
Got it. And then Microsoft's leadership has changed quite dramatically, at least it appears from the outside, and it also appears that it's been quite positive. Any comments on what you think leadership is doing well that maybe other leaders can learn from? Are you
referring specifically to something, or just
the change of, I would say, like the CEO and just the leadership at the top more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, interesting fun fact, I've actually worked under all three CEOs of Microsoft. From Bill Gates to Steve Ballmer to Satya. And I would say, I was very fortunate to not work under Steve Ballmer for very long as a CEO, but in the work that I was doing, I had a lot of exposure to him in the context, because he had been around when Bill Gates was the CEO. I think what's really interesting about Satya's leadership is his cultural understanding, his understanding of ethics and how doing the right thing is so important. And that lens just transcends things like sustainability and climate and behaviors and interpersonal relationships and things like that. And so, that's been the right person at this sort of point in time, in some ways without even knowing it, because the real reason that Satya was actually brought into the CEO role in 2014, about 6 months before I started, was because he came out of the cloud business. And there was a recognition that the only way we're going to pivot Microsoft from software licenses to cloud services revenue stream is if we actually put the right person in place in the company. And that's really why Satya was put into the role, because he fully embraced and understood cloud services in a way that Steve Ballmer understood licenses.
Super interesting, and I think ethics and that long-term mindset is just so important from a leadership standpoint. And then last two questions. So what are you most excited about in Web3 when it comes to the crypto space?
It's a great question. I think we have not yet sort of delivered on the humanitarian opportunities. I'm hopeful that the examples I used earlier around, end-tier traceability for things like country of origin and guaranteed chain of custody and things like that are things that are, just amazing opportunities to go achieve. In addition to some of the work that I've been doing with some of my colleagues on raw materials and the avoidance of what are called conflict mines, where essentially there's, prevalent child labor, is critical right now to any high-tech industry supply chain. And so, we are on a journey to solve that. And, I started that journey with some of my colleagues a couple of years ago, and we've already held workshops on, what does it mean to work with companies like Gold Standard or Impact Gold on that are NGOs who work in the field around solving these massive humanitarian problems that are actually in the far reaches of the high-tech supply chain. It's now regulation, right? And so now it's no longer how do we do this, but how do we do it now, right? And so that's an interesting opportunity. I'm very excited about being able to actually start to deliver on some of that capability, that's now becoming business imperative. So that's interesting to me. I think in terms of the Web3 technical space, I'm very excited about what we can do with zero knowledge proofs. In particular, I mean, zero knowledge proofs are not unique tools for Web3, right? They're basically a transcendent technology, and like we've done with distributed systems and cryptographic encrypted protocols in the Web3 space, I think we'll be pushing the envelope of the zero knowledge proof space as well. So I think that's extremely interesting. And then I would say, going back to the point I made about AI earlier, AI transcends everything, right? And so there's a very interesting opportunity where we can actually take AI tooling and actually use it to help enable different types of conversations with Web3 endpoints, as an example.
Yeah, super exciting. And then last question is just, how are you Defiant?
I would say my my biggest defiance in general is just holding on to my beliefs regardless of what's going on. And I think that without doing that, you just can't get anywhere. I mean, I can look back at decisions that I've made, whether I decided to break glass, right, and ask for permission or ask for forgiveness later after I broke it, or where I said, no, I'm going to actually go through the front door, ask for permission, and a year and a half later have not delivered anything, right? I'm a very big fan of what actually Satya used the terminology, our CEO, called growth mindset. It's one of the things that he was talking about a lot when he started in his role 8+ years ago, and I'm very much embraced that, right? That I have an understanding of where the guardrails are, but also that the things that I want to achieve are not easily going to be achieved always by going through the front door, and so pushing the envelope and making some decisions that that are front door decisions versus break glass decisions is always important. Another way to say that is People often say, if you're not breaking things, you're not moving fast enough. And I think those are very important whenever you're trying to push forward in a mission or a vision that you have about something. And I'll just wind back to something I said earlier, is this is an anti-pattern of corporate employees. Corporate employees don't work this way, right? They fit into the mold. They wind up looking at the only sort of the success of their current role, and how does that equate to what they're being told by their manager or leaders that they should be thinking about and doing. Whenever you're in a transformation or an innovative role, leaders are not the ones who have the knowledge about what should be, right? It's the people who have, I shouldn't say that. You can't expect people above you, right, to know what you know, and have the conviction that what you know is right? And so you actually have to lead from the position you're in, regardless of who's above you and what they're telling you.
Yeah, and I'm actually curious, just as a founder, how has that culture shifted internally? Has there been a lot of turnover where people are more of a fixed mindset? They want it easy. They want to be told what to do. They don't want to be innovative. How have you guys gone about that?
I think actually, really interesting that you brought that up, because I don't often talk about the fixed mindset, but there's definitely if your leader, your most senior leader, the CEO, is saying to use your growth mindset, by definition, it means you can't have a fixed mindset about anything, right? Because that means you're not collaborative, you're not hearing other people, you're not hearing other people's ideas, right? And yes, that has been actually a massive change. Now, it's a company of 120,000 approximately people, so that change doesn't all happen at once, right? It doesn't, but the expectation that if you're dealing with someone with a fixed mindset, that's not okay, right, is there, right? Which is actually a good change. And I think you're right. I think a lot of people who had not understood that have moved on, right? And that's I think the company is better for it, and our culture is better for it.
Love that. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for staying over. I really appreciate the time.